It's an honor to be here, and in just a few minutes, I hope I can summarize about 30 years of experience with a small commercial apiary, or small by American standards at least. And it's located not far from here, just about 3 hours south in the Champlain Valley of Vermont. It's a dairy farming region. It's not actually typical of Vermont. It resembles more the dairy farming country of Wisconsin or Minnesota 20 or 30 years ago. But we have lots of resources for bees there. It's quite a good place for honeybees. It's possible to have a honey flow anytime during the warm months. Our crop comes mostly from the different clovers, alfalfa, purple vetch, and we have, again, good resources in the fall, goldenrod and aster. We have a huge build-up resource in the spring from dandelions, and also basswood and black locust trees also. So the potential for really good conditions for bees. Until recently, it was a very clean area too. We're starting to have, for the first time in my career, some of the problems my queen customers in the Midwest have described for decades to me. But anyway, for many years I have produced honey with about 300 colonies. I produce about between 400 and 600 nucleus colonies on standard combs to overwinter, and also maintained another 400 mating nukes for producing queens and catching queens. And those are maintained virtually year-round, overwintered also. So I should say at the beginning here that the whole aim of this whole venture was just to have a pleasant, healthy, and useful life living in the countryside without the need for another job or any other source of income. And by that measure, it has been a much bigger success than I ever could have imagined at the beginning. So where did I get the inspiration for what I've done, or the direction of the apiary? From nature first, of course. Thoroughly studied, but still inscrutable. A lot of the practical details of my apiary came that I lifted from Brother Adam's work. I just adapted it for our season, my environment, and American equipment. I also was very inspired by some of the early pioneers of commercial beekeeping in the United States. This is A.E. Manham in his bee yard. I call him my neighbor because he lived just about 8 miles from where I live now. He was one of the pioneers of early commercial beekeeping with outyards, and there's some great pictures in some of the old books of him going to the outyard with his horses equipped with bee suits of their own. And of course the bees themselves. Also, the practical aspects of my apiary was inspired quite a lot by the work of Sir Albert Howard, considered to be the father of modern organic farming in the English-speaking world. And his conclusion after his lifetime of work was that pests and diseases should be always seen as friends and allies rather than enemies to be destroyed. And that we should use them to tune up our systems, our agricultural practice. They should be used as indicators of where our practices are unbalanced or poorly adapted. And I also got a lot of inspiration from Masanobu Fukuoka, who brought agriculture and nature closer together than any other well-known person. So I always emphasize when I talk about my apiary that it was only by a combination of breeding and management used together that I was able to succeed in eliminating all the treatments from my apiary and running it for many years without any treatments at all. I used to focus on the breeding part as, maybe the most important, because we had to obtain a stock of bees that was not native to North America originally, but I'm not so sure now, and the management things are just as important, and these are the things that any beekeeper can use, no matter whether you're a commercial beekeeper with lots of colonies, a viable population yourself for breeding, or you just have a few colonies. And the key things about my management system began in 1986, when I first discovered by accident that 4-frame nucleus colonies could overwinter in my climate outdoors with just minimal protection. And this is the box that I have used the entire time, just a standard hive body divided in half with a feeder, and 2 colonies in that box. And this is my sort of optimum unit to overwinter my new queens and the first colonies that they established. And I won't go into the whole story of how this happened. I discovered it by accident. The old beekeepers before packaged bees used this quite a bit in the climate where I live, but it had been forgotten once packaged bees came on the scene and bees could be obtained so easily from the south. But after a couple of years of experimentation, I realized that with each unit arranged like this, with a standard two-story colony down below, and then a nucleus box, just like the one I showed before on top, wintered that way, so there'd be 3 colonies in each stack instead of just 1, that this would more than double the productive potential of the apiary, and it also was the key to establishing real bee breeding and real production of excess bees in the very northernmost parts of the U.S., which would no longer need to rely on obtaining bees from elsewhere. And this was the way I overwintered all my colonies for some years before the varroa mites came. The 2-story colony below, it just has a normal wooden inner cover, and then the nuke box on top, a piece of the blue styrofoam, and then the cardboard cover to cover the whole thing. So that was the situation when the tracheomite arrived. And I was just ramping this system up, starting to produce larger number of nucleus colonies, just starting to sell them. And the tracheomites came, and to us this was 1989 in my location. This just seemed like the end of the world to us, where we were used to a 5% winter loss, and suddenly we had 40, 50, 60%, or even more. But within just a few years, by just simply grafting from the best surviving colonies after this invasion, in just a few years, the bees had regained all of their resilience and strength and productivity, and in fact, they were actually better than the bees that I had were before I had the tracheomites. And this photo, I'd like you to try to remember what it looks like right now. This is in the early spring. You can see no grass has started to grow, and you tip the colony over and break it apart. Both boxes completely filled with bees, and the top box still very heavy with honey. I never had bees anything like this before the tracheomites came, and that's what convinced me that the mites had actually helped me to select bees like this much better than I could have myself. 10? I'm at 10. Okay, so anyway, that resulted in an apiary of 3 parts: honey production of nukes on standard combs, and these were much superior to packaged bees, and queen rearing. Raised all the queens, of course, for both nukes, and that was the situation when the varroa mites arrived. Things I added to help deal with the varroa mites was isolated mating apiary. I started keeping all the nucleus colonies in yards of their own. I started making my own foundation. And so my initial experiments, I knew, having the confidence from having watched the effect of the tracheomites on the apiary, I was hoping I could do the same thing with varroa mites. And I never would have attempted this or even thought of it if it hadn't been for my previous experience with the tracheomites. My initial experiments with leaving bees untreated revealed that the three parts of the apiary were very different in their susceptibility to damage. The queen rearing part of the apiary was able to live on its own even before I had any other resistant stock. But it was the introduction of the Russian bees that supplied the genetic component to my two-pronged method for dealing with this. And this was the best thing the USDA ever did for me, and I'll just have to leave it there for now. But as soon as I had the Russian-type bees, the nucleus production on standard combs could proceed without treatments, and after selecting for a few years, the honey production part of the apiary I was also able to leave untreated. So the nucleus colonies haven't been treated since, let's see, 1980, 1998. And the last treatment on any part of the apiary was April of 2002. So these are just a few frames from some of my breeder colonies. Dr. Winston? Do I have 2 minutes? Can I continue a little bit? Yeah, I think I can get through to the end, but here's the really interesting thing. If you remember that slide about with the tracheomite selected colony, this was the kind of colony that the varroa mite selected. A much smaller cluster, and you can see it's later in the spring. The grass is already starting to grow. A completely different kind of bee resulted from selection by varroa mites. And now some of my conclusions from all of this include that there has been a simple and straightforward solution to the varroa mite problem for commercial beekeepers who are stationary. There are now 4 beekeeper apiaries that have spun directly off of mine without treatments. This is not all of them. Some of them are other treatment-free beekeepers who worked it out on their own. But I think the real existential threat to beekeeping is not varroa mites, but the spread of industrial agriculture and the poisoning of our environment. And one last thing, though, I'm pretty convinced the future of real healthy beekeeping, both for hobbyists and for commercial beekeepers, is going to succeed or fail along with organic farming. And that's what we need to support as beekeepers. The best thing we can do for the bees is to help create much better habitat for them. And so I don't know what else to do except host a few beekeepers at my place every year, expose them to this, and hope they'll go on to use it themselves. And just a couple pictures from this year, the year of 1,000 swarms, and also a good crop of honey. Thank you very much.
Okay, is our next speaker ready? The next speaker